I'm just going to start off by, first of all, welcoming everybody who's joining us this evening, wherever you are. My name is Seán Crosson. I'm based here in Galway. You can see the old part of the university where I'm based, the University of Galway, in the background behind me here. But I'm also have the incredible privilege of being the general editor of Review of Irish Studies in Europe, or RISE journal. And I'll just say a few very general words about our journal before I hand you over to the president of the European Federation of Associations and Centres in Irish Studies, or EFACIS, Professor Katharina Rennhak, and also co-editor of the issue. So I'll hand over in a few moments, but just before that, just to give you a little bit of context for what we are. So the Review of Irish Studies in Europe, as a journal, we've been in existence since 2016. And we are an international, open access, peer-reviewed and multidisciplinary journal. And we publish articles and reviews within the very broad field of Irish studies, which, of course, as this issue, which we'll come to shortly, demonstrates, covers a broad range of areas, not just literature and history, but also areas like film, areas like politics, law, and indeed fine art, and more. And we aim to bring new and innovative research within and between this broad range of disciplines and areas to readers and to people with a general interest in Irish studies across Europe, and indeed beyond Europe, through the online facility that we have here in our platform. We have issues. Most of our issues tend to be themed issues, but we also have non-themed issues that bring together a range of interdisciplinary work. And we welcome submissions and proposals for issues. If you have a proposal, please do contact us. Our email is rise@efacis.eu. And we also have a review section in each of our issues. So if you are interested, on our platform, risejournal.eu, you'll find more information on books that we have available for review, and that is managed and coordinated by our reviews editor, Professor Sylvie Mikowski. And for reviews, you can send them to risereviews@efacis.eu. So just to say, the issue, and I'll hand it over to Kathy very soon, we're incredibly proud of this new issue, issue 6.2, which brings you perspectives on the Irish border. And it's, in my opinion, one of the strongest issues we've had to date. It has an incredibly rich range of interventions, looking at from the fields of history, from political science, from film studies, constitutional law, and theatre, all looking at aspects of the border and borderlands, and perhaps we're living in a period where ideas of the border and conceptions of the border and debates around borders are more important, and the research that's ongoing in these areas has never been more important than it is now. And I'm particularly grateful to the co-editors of this issue, to Katharina Rennhak, to Sandra Heinen, to Lance Pettitt, and to Sylvie Mikowski for the extraordinary work they have done in bringing together the rich range of contributors to this issue. And I know the issue has grown out of what was previously a conference event, and perhaps Kathy will talk more about that shortly. And later on in the session, I may have the opportunity at the end to just talk a bit about where we're going next with future issues. But at this point, I know you're all eager to hear more about the issue and to hear from the contributors to the issue. So I might hand you over to Katharina Rennhak, and she can introduce the contributors and tell you a little bit more about how this important issue has come about.
Yes, thank you very much, Seán, for these kind words. We're really happy to see the themed issue launched today, and I'm particularly honored to say a few words of introduction in the name of the whole editorial team of RISE 6.2. But Sylvie and Lance, please join in whenever you feel like there's something to add or improve about whatever I say. Unfortunately, some of the editors and contributors, or to be more precise, Sandra Heinen, Kirsten Sandrock, Jennifer Todd, and Eugene Carney cannot join us today. They would all really love to be here and have asked me to say hi to everyone, but they just can't be here for very good and different reasons. But instead of explaining those reasons, I would like to say that I am really delighted that so many of us who worked on this themed issue of RISE could make it here into this Zoom room tonight. And I would like to thank you all, dear colleagues, for your untiring support throughout the last 1.5 years, for your patience with us, editors sometimes, and also, of course, for joining us for this launch tonight. In the name of my co-editors, I would like to start this off not by summarizing our introduction. We do not want to spoil the exciting reading experience for you after all, but by contextualizing the end product a bit. RISE 6.2, Perspectives on the Irish Border, is the result of 2 exciting initiatives by Irish studies scholars on the European continent. Firstly, the SOFAIR organized French-Irish Studies itinerary, which was a series of guest lectures on the topic of borders that was held between February 2022 and October 2023, if I'm correct there, Sylvie. And it took place, which I think is really an exciting aspect of those Irish studies itineraries at several universities in France, building a network. 14, yeah, amazing. So we see also the EFACIS work behind that, and SOFAIR's strength, of course, that make such cooperations across universities possible. The second event was as follows. As part of Lance Pettit's inaugural traveling visiting professorship in Irish studies at the University of Wuppertal, so my home university, an international symposium on Irish border narratives was hosted in June 2022. And both these projects, the French-Irish Studies itinerary and the visiting professorship in Irish studies, were funded by the Emigrant Support Program of the Department of Foreign Affairs of Ireland, and they were also both developed under the auspices of EFACIS. And Sylvie and I met just at the right point in time to realize that we were working on this together at the same time, and that it would be a very good idea, we thought, to team up and produce this issue as you now see it online together. I'm sure you also see now why RISE, the review of Irish studies in Europe, this open access, peer-reviewed, multidisciplinary academic journal of EFACIS, is exactly the right publication platform for this themed issue, because the initiatives were started from EFACIS members and on the continent. Our truly heartfelt thanks also go to Seán Crosson, General Editor of RISE, and to the whole board of editors of this journal, and of course also to Seán Deltour, whom you have met earlier on here, the EFACIS coordinator, who does put so much work into this project and into the journal and many other EFACIS projects. Thank you for all the work you've put into this issue. True to the interdisciplinary character of RISE, the issue 6.2 collects different academic perspectives on the Irish border, assembling contributions by historian Mary E. Daly and Richard English and Jennifer Todd, both of the latter two political scientists, of film and media expert Ciara Chambers, constitutional law expert Oren Doyle, and literary scholars Lance Pettitt and Kirsten Sandrock, both also with some expertise in film studies. It concludes with an interview by literary scholar Sandra Heinen with the Borderland playwright Ocean Kearney, who is co-author of plays that reflect on both literal and symbolic Irish borders. Or in other words, the issue brings different academic and cultural perspectives on the Irish border into a dialogue. And from their various disciplinary backgrounds, the articles assembled analyze politicians and artists' conceptions of the Irish border, as well as interactions with the border by members of the border communities. They discuss inside and outside, or internal and external perspectives on the Irish borderlands, and they take the historical dimension of the border into consideration, reflecting also on the significance of the imagination and the arts, as well as on potential pathways into the future. So much for a brief start. And I'm now delighted to hand over to Mary E. Daly to kick us off with a more detailed view into the individual contributions.
Thank you very much, Katharina and Seán. And I want to begin by really congratulating whoever originally came up with the idea of studying the border in this fashion, because I hope Richard and others will agree with me, it's been a very neglected topic in Ireland, and it's one that is of both scholarly and immense contemporary relevance. So I think the conference and this and your other exercises and this journal issue is extremely timely. It speaks to a contemporary need, particularly within Ireland and among those who are interested in Irish studies. So well done. I mean, I grew up along the border, and Seán, I can hear your accent as well. And I've been conscious that my mental map of Ireland is rather different to that of people who did not have first-hand experience of the border zone. I really do agree with those who live there who think that they're a forgotten people and in a third country, because there is an awful lot of interest in the high politics between Dublin and Belfast, British, Irish and otherwise, but drilling down into the border region is something that has been sadly neglected by many scholars, politicians and public servants. So this is very, very timely. Now that has changed. It's changed because of a variety of factors, and I go through a little bit of that in my paper. First of all, I think the literary scholars, people like Colm Tobin and Darragh MacDonald, who also walked around the border, both incidentally history graduates from UCD, began to put the story to some extent on the map. I think then a lot of the funding that came in under the International Fund for Ireland and other EU funding also gave an opportunity to concentrate on border areas, because they are quite disadvantaged in many respects, and it's not just because of their agricultural profile. Their borderness has certainly disadvantaged them, and recent figures I've just seen are making that picture very clear. The other forces that have really come into play to bring it to our attention were the British a decision to leave the EU, and I think many people rediscovered the border because of that particular occasion. And then as well, I would focus on the decade of centenaries. And I've just come from the final farewell lunch after almost 12 years serving on the government advisory group that it's steering events from 2012 up to the end of this year. And this did put a lot of engagement into local communities. We really highlighted them. And a lot of that engagement in local communities and looking back 100 years has necessarily focused on what their life was like before the border and with the imposition of the border. So there has been a real revitalization, or in fact, I think for the first time in many cases, engagement with the issue of the border that has gone beyond the personal story that would have always been there. And this is really popping up in all kinds of ways. I mean, Oren at the end might mention it, but there is the project ARANS, which is academic research in Ireland, North and South, which is hosted by the Royal Irish Academy. The partners in it are Notre Dame University and the Irish Times. And there is a slew of vital information coming out under that heading, including wonderful work by Oren, that is highlighting the fact that the mutual ignorance of people north and south is quite profound. The distances between them are quite profound, and the need to engage and to understand one another, regardless of what the future political and constitutional settlement of Ireland is. I think the people living on the island need to build, a closer engagement. So, what struck me. My paper is based on what I gave in Wuppertal, and I was struck that if I was writing it now, there is so much more material that I would have to engage with. I mean, it's only 18 months, but a lot this is a very busy space at the moment. So I just want to say to you, congratulations, you have really captured the zeitgeist in this particular publication, and very well done for that.
Thank you very much, Mary. And I hand on to Richard English, and we'll take questions in the end, I'd say, after all the contributions have been introduced. Richard.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm absolutely delighted and honoured to be publishing a piece in this issue of this journal. I think, as Professor Daly said, the importance and the contemporary significance and the timeliness could not have been better judged, and so I'm really thrilled to be part of the issue and delighted to be getting a chance to speak briefly to you today. My article in the issue is entitled "The IRA and the Partition of Ireland." As we reflect on perspectives on the Irish border, it seemed to me that the complex politics of the organisation, which has been the most lastingly aggressive opponent of the Irish border, represents a really serious subject for us to consider. Trained as a political historian, my approach, which is reflected in the article, is one that looks at things in terms of long-term approaches to continuity and to change, which is an approach conditioned by a sense that contingency is probably more important here than inevitability. I think when we discuss the Irish border, past, present and future, it's not inevitable, the things that have happened or will happen, and I think respect for that is crucial. Again, as an historian, I think the messy complexity rather than neat categories is the way to approach it. And I also think it's important to think about different levels of analysis: individual, small group, organizational, regional, national, global. And so this is a historically minded paper, and it takes 3 case studies of IRA thinking, I suppose 3 case studies of IRA hostility to the border, 2 of them individuals and 1 an organisation. The individuals are the Donegal-born IRA Republican Socialist Peadar O'Donnell, born in 1893, the Mayo-born IRA leader Ernie O'Malley, born in 1897, and then the Provisional IRA, founded in 1969, and formally calling off what they referred to as their armed struggle in 2005. So they're different units of analysis, they're different periods, They have different regional origins and different dynamics of struggle. And I hope that that allows for different windows on the complexity of reflecting on the IRA's approach to the Irish border and what that might tell us. O'Donnell and O'Malley were really talented, compelling, important figures within militant Irish republicanism. I often think of them as being figures who in some ways are as interesting as the 1916 duo that they respectively echo. I mean, Peadar O'Donnell in the tradition of James Connolly, his Marxist republicanism, and in some ways Ernie O'Malley in the tradition of the spiritual republicanism of Patrick Pearse. And I think as with Connolly and Pearse, they exemplify different trends and emphases within Irish republicanism, but they're both really important. The Provisional IRA coming later respected both O'Donnell and O'Malley in different ways, and they too had a complex politics which accompanied the violence of the IRA. When people talk about the IRA and the Irish border, understandably, it's the violence which grips people's attention. I think that's entirely to be expected, but there was always a complex and evolving politics around it, and that's what the article tries to look at. The article has a lot of what I hope people will find to be evocative quotation from these figures and this organization, which looks at the dynamics of what they thought about the border and why. I don't have time here to recite that evidence, but I hope you'll all find it interesting when you read the article. What I can do, I think, very, very briefly is set out some of the wider thematic points to which I hope these three case studies can point as we think about the Irish border. So 3 quick points and then I'll conclude, but you can read in the article the way in which I develop the argument. The first is that in none of these three case studies, the post-1916 War of Independence or the anti-treaty IRA campaign that O'Donnell and O'Malley were involved in, or the post-1969 armed struggle of the Provisional IRA, in none of those campaigns did the IRA achieve their central strategic goal of a united, independent, sovereign Ireland. The border was created and then it endured. And this is part of a wider, sometimes contentious debate I've been involved in elsewhere about, does terrorism work? I'm not suggesting that these IRA figures or movements achieved nothing. I think they achieved significant things. But strategic victory eluded them, and it's vital and important to recall that. Briefly, a second point is that violence by the IRA and by the IRA's opponents did unquestionably produce something else, which was blood-stained polarization. Nationalist versus unionist in Ireland, of course, but also nationalist versus nationalist, whether in the 1920s Civil War and its lengthy legacy, or in the Troubles North after the 1960s. Violence has proved historically far more certain to generate human suffering than it has to generate high-sounding political outcomes. And as we think about the tragic news from Israel-Palestine, I think that's a reflection which is of profundity beyond Ireland. And third, a close reading of O'Malley, O'Donnell, the Provos and their arguments suggests that as we consider the Irish border now in 2023, I think we require much greater empathy than has become common in contemporary debate. What I argue is that what makes these Republicans' politics, I think, so explicably alluring to so many people, the understandable politics of national self-determination, for some a powerful cultural nationalism, for others a religiously inflected view of politics, for some on the left an economic imperative to oppose capitalist imperialism and so forth. These things made their politics understandably alluring, but they simultaneously made their politics equally understandably repugnant to their opponents, because those other people had identity which rested on a profound attachment to exactly what these committedly Republican figures opposed, and opposed in violence. Now here I think Eric Hobsbawm's suggestion that the historian's major task is to understand even what we can least comprehend, is a theme which not only runs through the article that I've written, but runs through what I think we need in society as we reflect on the Irish border now. And I suppose my suggestion is, for those who are instinctively hostile to the IRA, it's vital to understand the complex, profound, explicable politics set out in this article, without which the IRAs of the 20s or beyond into the late 20th, early 21st century simply cannot be comprehended. Explaining something does not necessitate endorsement. But for those who are sympathetic to the IRA's long record of political violence, who are sympathetic to the IRA's antagonism towards the Irish border. I think it's vital to understand why the politics that were understandably meaningful for these Republicans and were, and for many people still remain, understandably repellent for the IRA's opponents. So it's a historically minded article looking at case studies of people hostile to the Irish border, but I hope that it informs some of the principles which I think we need to bear in mind as we now discuss the Irish border, its possible erosion in the future or its possible endurance. And the article points away from political deafness and encourages a dialogue, a respect, a compromise, I suppose, and a listening approach as we think about the partition of Ireland and what the Irish border has meant for all of those involved. So I'm honoured to be in the issue. I look forward to the discussions that this issue prompts, and I thank you for your time in listening to my brief argument there. Thanks.
Thank you, Richard, for this really thought-provoking contribution and for joining us tonight and introducing it. I would now hand over to our heroic Ciara, who's joined us in the middle of a power cut and can share slides. So
the moment the power has come back on again, so fingers crossed.
All right.
Have some light here. So firstly, thanks to Lance, Katharina, Sandra and Sylvie for all your hard work in bringing this issue together. My article explored cinema newsreels and how they represented the Irish border, both before and after partition. Newsreels were the only form of moving image news available to the general public before the advent of television. So they were shown in the collective setting of the cinema, which had obviously an influence over how they reported on various local and international events. They could be quite propagandistic in tone, particularly during wartime. And they are really interesting social documents in terms of telling us what audiences were shown, or in many cases not shown, about the events and personalities of the day. They were often criticised for being too trivial in some cases or lacking in context. And this, of course, was a big problem when it came to covering Irish politics, which was ever changing and really complex. So the newsreels really struggled in representing Irish stories. And interestingly, for most of the first half of the 20th century, Irish audiences watched British newsreels. There weren't many instances of local production. They were sporadic and short-lived. So these newsreels tended to be imbued with a pro-British and pro-establishment agenda. They represented North and South very differently and often in really simplistic and reductive terms. So I'm going to show you just a few images as examples of this. So here you see two items from May and June 1921. One from both from Gaumont Graphics, sorry, in this case. And you'll see on one hand, we've Dublin Custom House ablaze, while in Belfast, Lord Londonderry is having a garden party. So while Dublin's on fire, in Belfast, they're having nice tea parties. And that was something that kind of continued as a pattern. You'll see here again, Dublin in flames, the forecourts in flames, damage to buildings, in an item covering civil war in Ireland, July 1922, while in Belfast we have the City Hall in the background, and in the foreground a very organised Orange Order march and parade. So this is described as a peaceful 12th in Belfast. So you see some of the rhetoric, those examples kind of proliferated in the newsreels throughout the 20s, 30s, and particularly during the Second World War. So the border was represented in three main ways in the newsreels. Firstly, as an imagined marker between North and South before partition, as the newsreels prepared the viewing public for the establishment of two separate states. Secondly, as a real site of separation between North and South with physical consequences associated with the traversing of the boundary, such as smuggling or the leaking of information during wartime. And thirdly, as a boundary that has both real and imaginary connotations for viewers who had access to different viewing experiences on either side of the border due to distribution networks and censorship. This had a physical impact in terms of what bodies in cinema watched on the screen, and it had an imaginary impact on how concepts of North and South were cemented in the minds of the viewing public, due to which stories were covered and how they were presented. This was particularly evident during the Second World War, when De Valera enacted a really strict censorship on the cinema. There could be no mention of the war or of any of the belligerents, whereas in Northern Ireland, audiences watched newsreels that contained about 85% of news about the war. So they were really dominated with war stories, and a lot of those took the form of information films trying to rally the public in Northern Ireland in the war effort. So this partitionist mentality kind of emerged in the 1910s in coverage of the Home Rule movement, and really intensified during World War I in coverage of Ireland and its relationship with the war, particularly through soldiers across Ireland serving in the war effort. So this is the sense where the newsreels are preparing the public for kind of North and South and a separation before partition is even on the agenda. Then, of course, in the War of Independence and the Civil War, there's a very clear North-South divide emerging. That intensifies through the 1930s, through all the economic turbulence of the 1930s. And by World War II, it's really reached a pinnacle as Ireland is kind of encouraged by the newsreels to reconsider its neutral status, and Northern Ireland is shown as being fully involved in the war effort, even though we know it wasn't exactly like that. So when I use the term partitionist mentality, I'm drawing on the work of Martin McLuhan, and in particular his exploration of early radio broadcasting. So I hope it's okay if I finish on a personal note to acknowledge the fact that sadly Martin died just 2 months ago. And I wanted to acknowledge his tremendous contribution to the world of Irish cinema and to Irish studies more broadly. Many scholars in these fields have extensively read and cited his work, and he leaves behind him a legacy of PhD students who've gone into academia to continue that work in Irish cinema in particular. He was an amazing colleague, someone who was an incredible mentor to the next generation. So I wanted just to acknowledge that and to kind of pay tribute to his comradeship, his integrity, his compassion, his good humor, and just to acknowledge the huge loss it is on his death. So he's someone who'll be missed a great deal, and hopefully the extensive work in Irish cinema that he began and continued throughout his career will continue in the scholars that he mentored. So thank you for that.
Here.
Yes, thank you so much, Ciara, for that, for the introduction, and for the important way of really memorizing also those who contribute to do the research we do together. Now, next would be Kirsten Sandrock, who can't be here. I just say that what awaits you in our themed issue on perspectives on the Irish border with Kirsten's contribution is an article on Kenneth Branagh's semi-autobiographical film Belfast. As you all know, it tells the story of a young boy body growing up in Belfast in the sectarian border zones that internally fissured the state of Northern Ireland. And Kirsten Sandrock, in her article, suggests that the movie's enormous international critical success partly rests on its Glocal approach to Belfast's border zones. And she shows how the film uses a number of aesthetic devices to turn the local experiences of body into a global narrative about childhood, family, and life in border zones. Among these tools are the use of self-referential framing devices, the child's perspective, and elements of nostalgia that link local history to transnational diasporic bonds of affection. And thus the film, she argues, creates connections across cultural, ideological, and physical borders. Lance can be here. The inaugural traveling, visiting professor in Irish studies, who even when you applied for this position, introduced the idea that you would like to organize a conference on the Irish border. That's what we did. So thanks again, Lance. This adventure also comes full circle today with the launch of this issue.
Right.
Over to you.
Kathy, thank you very much. And I just would like to endorse Ciara's remarks about Martin McClune. He mentored me informally when I knew him in Dublin, and it was a very sad news to hear of his loss. But I mean, I'm very pleased to be here this evening, and I'd want to thank you, Kathy, Sandra in her absence, and Sylvie as co-editors. It's been really great to work on this project. This issue is a kind of legacy of that time that you were talking about, my time with you guys in Wuppertal. And so it's especially important to me and delights me that I'm involved in this project. And I'm very pleased that that time has a kind of an afterlife in these pages that you can all read. I should thank briefly the British Academy and the Department of Foreign Affairs, who helped fund my time in Wuppertal and also the research. My essay deals with one author and 3 short stories. It's called Border Tropes in Eugene McCabe's Fermanagh trilogy. So the essay explores 3 short stories, Cancer, Heritage, and Siege, that became known as the Fermanagh trilogy. These stories were written separately between 71 and 1976. It's significant, I think, that Eugene McCabe died in 2020, the year that marked the centenary of the legislation that partitioned Ireland and created the border, a border that he spent most of his adult life living on and farming as a farmer and writing about as a fiction writer. I just want to make 4 points in my brief remarks. So I think that these stories are significant in a simple way, really, that they put on paper the fact that they're written from the rural border. The rural border during the 70s, an intense period of political conflict about the border and the existence of the Northern Irish state. That's already been alluded to by Professor English. Most representations of what's now called the Troubles tend to be driven by a wholly urban view of the North and focusing on Derry and Belfast. So I think from that point of view of just representing the ruralness of that border is really important, and that picks up a point that Mary has made earlier on as well. The other thing that I will add is that I think at the core of the 3 stories, the central story, is the story, a focus on the Protestant rural experience of life during those 70s. And I think that's another important kind of corrective to a Dublin and a London focused news agenda. So the stories are significant in those respects, I think. I mentioned it, but McCabe lived and worked on a landscape that was a scenario of dispute between intimate enemies. And whilst the character and the setting of the Fermanagh trilogy were contemporary to McCabe, and when they were published, I think what my analysis tries to show in the essay is that McCabe was mobilizing in his prose and in the stories that he was telling. He mobilizes what I call the 4 tropes of the border, and these are all have a deep kind of history to them. So, and I'll just name them. Obviously, people who are interested can go in and read. But so I just identify these 4 tropes. The border as a kind of Badlands place. The border as a kind of bucolic space, rather oddly, but they sit together. And thirdly, the border as acting as a barrier of different kinds. Actually, the stories demonstrate how it fails as a barrier, how it fails to keep things out and keep people apart. And finally, in psychic terms, a trope of the border as a bad dream. Again, I'm not going to go into details. If people want to talk to me about that, I'm very happy to, but they can read the essay. I want to develop that idea of where these 4 tropes come from. Living on the border, McCabe is in Monaghan, Fermanagh, that area. That lived experience, a long life farming there, gave him an understanding of how that borderland makes people's lives a daily crossing of invisible lines of social difference that are sectarian, but they're also class-based, and that characterizes the countryside that he knew. And internalizing that awareness over a lifetime as a writer and across generations, I think produces a condition that I call in the essay borderliness. And that borderliness is what is the kind of the expressive dynamism for McCabe's writing in these stories. And it's a writing. His prose is shaped by history, by the geography of that contested place, and by an Ulster Scots English, which comes down to him from the 17th century plantation of Ireland. And the fact also that he was born in Scotland originally before moving to the border. So that sense of the history is a history which is predating the formation of the border and the state that he's written about in these 3 stories. So on those points, I think I will finish my remarks. Hope I haven't gone over time. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Lance. And at this point, maybe I should say hi from so many students who haven't explicitly asked me to say hi, but whom I constantly meet and who still remember your exciting classes. And when I ask them where their interest for Irish studies comes from, for example, some of them still say, I attended Professor Pettit's classes, and of course I'm interested in all things Irish. So thanks again for much more than.
That's wonderful to hear. And I actually taught, just to let people know, I taught a seminar course on the border. And I found that a very, really exciting and fun thing to do. So thanks again for that opportunity to do that.
Thank you, Lance. Unfortunately, Jennifer Todd cannot be here, and I feel especially bad about that because she said I can make any day in December, just not the 6th. But since almost everybody else could make it today, we decided we'll stick to the date after all. Unfortunately, you can't hear her, and I will just tell you that her exciting article titled Symbolic, Social and Territorial Boundaries, Paradoxes of Groupness and Potentials for Change in Northern Ireland takes historical developments very seriously. That's why we thought it nicely frames the first part of our themed issue, which, as you now know, starts also with historical perspectives on the Irish border. Jennifer Todd's main focus then is, however, on recent developments, analyzing the persistent renewal of social and symbolic boundaries despite extensive political and popular endeavors to transcend them, since the implementation of the Good Friday Agreement in 1998. She suggests that any way forward must be radically interventionist. And she also makes concrete suggestions of how such interventions could look like. Everything else and more details you'll find in her article available online. And it's now my pleasure to hand over to Oren Doyle, who, as it looked for a long time, could not join us, but now we're really happy that you did make it and that you are here and that you introduce what is also a new section in RISE, your think piece. We thought we wanted think pieces that in a way complement the in-depth scholarly articles, and we think you made an ideal first contribution also to introduce this new rubric for RISE. Great to have you here, Oren, but over to you.
Thanks, Katharina, and thanks for the introduction. The welcome was an honor for me to be able to participate in the conference in Wuppertal and then in the journal. And I think like the origin of the phrase think piece was a nervous email after I was asked to participate, in which I said like, yes, I could do something for the journal, but please do not expect too much, was my thinking behind it. So hopefully it still works okay. And it's titled Mapping the Dural Border Between Ireland and Northern Ireland. And what I mean by that is that I found it unhelpful to try to think about perhaps borders in general, but particularly this border in terms of just boundaries that happen to be there between states. And instead to think about laws as having a spatial dimension, because laws apply in some places and not others. And there tends to be a lot of laws clustered together that have the same spatial dimension, and that's in dural space, I call it in the article. And the border is where different dural spaces bump up against each other or one another. And we experience crossing borders as the friction of moving from one dural space to another, from a place where the laws in one place are different from the laws in the other place. And I think that suggests that this is helpful for understanding the Northern Irish border, and perhaps more helpful than understanding it simply as a border between states, because there are in fact different dural borders. The dural border doesn't precisely map the boundary between Ireland and the United Kingdom, and suggests that there's two ways that that's the case, both the Northern Ireland Protocol, now renamed as the Windsor Framework, which extends the dural scope of some European Union laws into Northern Ireland, and also the Common Travel Area, essentially a reciprocal application of rules that treat non-citizens as if they were citizens. That sort of breaks down the typical idea of what a state boundary should be. And I suggest briefly that if we focus on the Windsor Framework, as now called, as being an attempt to minimize that friction of moving between dural spaces, it appears eminently sensible, and how could anybody disagree with it? But if we understand the Windsor Framework as allowing a misalignment of the dural space and the democratic space, I think we can better understand why people would find it problematic. I'll just suggest that without taking any views on its overall desirability as a way of understanding the debates around it. The final part of the article that I'll mention is what Mary referred to earlier, which does sort of summary of research funded by the Shared Island Unit, the Department of Taoiseach and the Irish Research Council, of a project trying to map the convergence and divergence of laws on the two parts of the island since 1922. And the number of legal academics working in different areas of law. We matched up somebody with Northern Ireland expertise, with Republic of Ireland expertise, to try to start to assess to what extent the laws remained the same, where they had diverged. And I think we found first that this was a huge exercise, but we were able to come to some tentative conclusions from sort of just selective focus. And I think, okay, I'm only mentioning one or two, but perhaps unsurprisingly, areas of law that are driven by legislation tend to diverge more than areas of law that are driven by judicial decision-making in cases, which makes sense because case-based decision-making is always backward-looking. But oddly, the alignment that you see between Ireland and Northern Ireland in case-based areas of law comes much more from the fact that they're both having regard to London than that Dublin or Belfast is having any regard to each other. And that underpins perhaps the broader conclusion that was coming out that Mary referred to, is just the lack of cross-reference between the jurisdictions, the lack of knowledge among legal academics on either side of the border about what was happening on the other side. And so we hope that that project, at least, as well as the research that is there, that's appearing in the Aaron's series. You can find the various articles online there if you're interested. There's a report you can find on the internet that presents the research in greater detail than I'm doing here, but as well as those outputs that it might allow greater dialogue across the border among legal academics. And we can just understand better what is happening, not so very far away, but also use that to understand better what is happening in our own part of the island as well. So that's all I'll say about my article, but really pleased to be here today. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Oren, for this really also very important contribution to our themed issue. Before I hand over to our chair, Seán Crosson, in a second again, let me just say that unfortunately Sandra, Heinen and Eugene Kearney can't be here. The interview that Sandra conducted with Eugene is really worth a read. It's as informative as it is entertaining. And the two discuss the role of the Irish border, obviously, in the work of Eugene Kearney, particularly in his two plays, or in the two plays, The Alternative, published in 2019, and The Border Game, published in 2021, which he co-wrote with Michael Patrick. Have fun reading that and the two plays. Better watch them performed on the stage somewhere. Over to you, Seán.
Thank you, Kathy. And thank you sincerely to all of the contributors here today. Really, really fascinating insights into the important work that you've done in the articles. I also want to add to the comments made by Ciara and Lance regarding Martin McLuhan. As a film studies scholar, I too am hugely indebted to the work that Martin has done. He's left an incredible legacy to us all, any of us who's engaged with film in the Irish context. I know when I started as an academic, as a researcher in Irish film, Martin's work, particularly his Irish film monograph from 2000 was really a seminal piece that has informed, and it's provided a bedrock, I suppose you could say, to Irish film studies in the 21st century. So his loss is deeply felt by all of us. I knew Martin not nearly as well as Ciara and others who were colleagues of him, but from my encounters with him, he was also an extraordinarily generous and kind man and human being, and somebody whose company I greatly appreciated on the few occasions I met him at conferences. So I think it's important to remember that legacy as well, to Irish film and to Irish studies more broadly. So anyway, thank you all for your contributions. There's so much covered here, and it just, as I think several of you said, it's but a brief introduction to the extraordinary richness in the articles in this important issue of our journal. We've a couple minutes if there's any questions perhaps people wanted to ask of the contributors here today, or comments people wanted to make. I know we have several people. If you want to turn on your mics, or if you want to use the chat function. Hold on, I see there's some comments. Perhaps there's questions already in the chat here. Have been okay. Sylvie had to leave us, unfortunately. Lance, was that your comment about the obit? Was that about Martin, doing an obit for Martin? Yeah.
Just an idea, as you
Yeah,
were
no,
talking.
that's a great idea. That's a really good idea. Yeah. I mean, that's something we definitely, yeah, I'll come back to you on that, Lance. I think that's a great idea. I think it's something we should do and we will do in the near future. Are there any other questions or comments from people who've joined us today, or remarks would you like to make on the papers?
I'm happy to ask a question, John.
Yeah, brilliant, Jost. Thank you.
Apart from using the opportunity to say hello to Mary and Richard, who I haven't seen for too long, particularly Mary. But also being in Holland, I had to think of the famous book that may be a little bit outdated, but The Border as a Cultural Divide by a compatriot of mine.
Yeah.
And I was wondering a little bit, because after all, we are a multidisciplinary journal. So the way that the border is treated in sort of in the practical sense and in the mental sense. And that, of course, goes beyond the actual introduction of the border itself in 1920, because the division in the mind, the border, the divide in the mind was maybe already there before the border. So without having a really practical question, I would really like all the contributors, if they feel able, to muse a little bit about those tensions between the border as a practical thing with all its implications. And I was really very interested in all these strange things that Mary has been described, what happened when the border was there, about parishes and GPs that had to do strange things to be able to function after the border, which I never realized. So that tension between the border as a physical entity and a political issue that people fight against, or that you can make cultural issues about, and the mental divide between North and South. And that does not just apply to Protestants versus Catholics, but also versus Northern people and Southern people, and even people on the border maybe perceiving things even differently, as Mary was referring to, being from the border area. So maybe I would invite some to muse a little bit about that. Seán can decide who can speak first.
Well, I'd love to say a couple of things about that, if I may, Seán. And I mean, I think it's a great question. Yes, it's nice to see you, albeit on Zoom. I mean, very, very briefly, I think what you raise is so important, because it has, in terms of time period and in terms of place and in terms of different zones of people's lives, the border is very, very different. So I mean, I think that for some people and in some things, partition predated partition, if you see, and you refer to that. But in other ways, many aspects of things remain all Ireland or cross-border despite partition. And I think that varies from place. I mean, some of the border zone that we've been hearing about, I mean, we go across the border a lot, and there are areas where it's quite a liminal space. Even after Brexit, it seems to me that's remained. But also it varies very much whether you're talking about certain kinds of sport rather than other kinds of sport, or certain cultural things rather than others. Certain organizations have persisted despite, some surprisingly so, perhaps despite partition. So I think one of the difficulties with the polarizing political arguments about it, Joost, has been that there's been a kind of binary presentation of things which are actually much, much more complicated in terms of actual lived life. And I think for those discussions, Aaron's has been mentioned. I think it's made a huge contribution, the Aaron's work. And one of the things that it does is it unpicks some of those complexities. And I think whether Northern Ireland continues to exist or not, I think recognizing those regional and thematic variations in what the border means for people is hugely important. Because I find in conversations in Belfast, the same person will have 10 different views on the border, depending on what it is you're talking about with them. And I think unpicking that would be really helpful. Not easy to do if you're trying to get elected as a politician up here, but it seems to me a really important thing. So I think the question is a very powerful one.
Yeah, Mary, did you want to come in on that?
I do, yeah, I'm live, yeah. I mean, I agree with. I think you really are. I think there are multiple border experiences depending on who you are, where you happen to live, what kind of lifestyle you have. And I mean, Orla and myself happened to be at the same conference last Saturday, and we were talking about today. And there's a big, and I was surprised when he said that the lawyers, North and South, did not interact with each other on a particularly strong basis, whereas, as Richard would know, the historical profession have been, working closely together from the 1930s. And there's party of esteem, the leading journals have an editor from Northern Ireland, an editor from Ireland, and we always have gone. I've been in and out of Belfast probably more times during my academic career than I have been to Cork or to Galway. But Belfast is actually a closer home for me in the sense that there's been just so much more going on there. And people like Richard have been, we've all interacted, we know each other, we are a community of scholars that share so much in common. And my sister is a hospital consultant, and again, she would have a good community through the Royal College of Physicians of friends, and that again are based in Northern Ireland. But there are other sections. I mean, what's coming through from some of those questionnaires, I mean, stuff I wrote for that paper I'm relieved to find been backed up by Aaron's questionnaires about the lack of journeys north and south, the lack of interaction north and south between so many people. There are massive zones of ignorance, and that immediately lends itself to all kinds of stereotyping and to othering. And I mean, there is an awful lot of othering that goes on, and it can be Catholics from the Republic othering Northern Catholics. It can be, I had an interesting conversation with a friend of mine some months ago, who is Church of Ireland based in Leinster, and talking about the fact that their new Church of Ireland minister is coming from Northern Ireland, and he will have it, and he has a different mindset to an awful lot of issues. I mean, he was effectively othering a fellow clerk, a co-religionist who was coming from the other part of Ireland. So this comes through in all kinds of ways. Experiences can be shared, and they also differ. And the nuances and the complexities of this have created all kinds of mental borders, and the lines are not consistent. I mean, I think if you lived in Inishowen, which is the very northern part of Donegal, whether you live in the Republic or in Northern Ireland is at times almost a moot point. I think their mental borders are very flexible indeed. So it is a very, very complex story, and I think it's important that we realise that a lot of the practical borders have gone. They haven't really been re-established to any great extent post-Brexit, I'm relieved to say. But there are the deeper borders of the mind that I think have to be at least understood. And as I said, regardless of what the political outcome will be in the future, these are important.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you very much, and thank you. Richard unfortunately, Richard had to leave us and Adam had to leave us. I just wanted to add, Mary, you mentioned you recognise my accent as someone who, and I do, I come from Cavan, I think, but is it Monaghan you're from originally?
I grew up in Carrickmacross.
Yes, which is only 15 miles from where I grew up, or less. I grew up near Shercock, which you
well, our house was on the Shercock Road.
Oh, so we're not too far apart in terms of where we grew up. And those ideas of borders and minds are something that was very evident. I mean, obviously, we both grew up relatively close to the border, but in terms of the immediate communities we lived in, there was certainly borders in like before I came to Galway, there was a clear sense of the Protestant community and the Catholic community. You'll be aware of this as well, and how they defined each other, and they had their own kind of sense of a distinct identity, and there was limited interaction. If you remember, like going to school. Now, I went to a comprehensive in Cothill, which you'll know.
Oh yeah.
Which was mixed, but obviously all the national schools weren't, and even in the comprehensive, which was unusual and groundbreaking in the 1960s when they first were set up, the Protestants kept to themselves. They had their own kind of groups, and there was limited interaction. So those borders existed even in the context where we passed each other. There was not a huge amount, and it was something that I suppose I only really fully grasped when I moved to Galway, where you didn't have that sense of, it existed, but it wasn't as obvious or as apparent as it was when I was growing up, because we lived like literally kilometers or sometimes neighbors very close, but we didn't actually interact on a day-to-day basis in the way that you did with your own community. Now, I don't know, I imagine those things are changing, evolving, thankfully, that over time those kind of borders are moving to some extent, or those communities are becoming closer together. Where that will go into the future, I don't know. I think these things are constantly changing, of course, and I think the peace process was massive in terms of allowing for the very fact that the border that we grew up with, that was very present, and that if you crossed into the north, there was a physical infrastructure you had to negotiate, that has had a huge difference, and maybe there's important learnings there in terms of other borders that exist internationally, which I think the issue itself speaks to, that the importance of finding ways to come together.
Katharina, you might be interested to know that about 6 weeks ago, I ended up having to speak at an event in the Royal Irish Academy, and it was under the Aaron's label, and it was a conference that they'd organised, and one of the leading speakers was the Mayor of Leipzig, and there was a whole delegation in from Germany, and the German ambassador, and somebody had got a brilliant idea that I should make some comments that would draw distinct comparisons and contrasts between a German unification and an Irish unification. So anyway, but it was quite enlightening, and I was immediately mentally brought back to Wuppertal when I was trying to work my way around it. Anyways, but you were in my mind.
Thank you. That's interesting to learn. I know there are colleagues in Leipzig who are doing Irish and also teaching the Irish language.
Well, that's a historic centre for Celtic languages, and in fact, we learned a lot about how to approach the Irish language in a scientific fashion from scholars in places like Leipzig.
Thanks, Mary. Thanks, Kathy. I know we're gradually losing people to other commitments, including putting kids to bed and so on. So, and I know we're in different time zones and so on. So, look, maybe it's a time when we might bring things to a close. Before I do, as well as thanking everybody who's contributed here today, to all the speakers, to the editors. I also want to pay special tribute to the extraordinary work that Seán has done. Seán Del Torres, our EFACIS coordinator, but also the assistant editor of Rise, and she has been an enormous support. And really, Rise couldn't exist. Perhaps EFACIS couldn't exist without the work that Seán does in making everything possible, and just keeping everything moving forward. So thank you sincerely, Seán, for all that you've done. I also want to thank the editorial board of Rise, and I'm delighted that just Agustín could be here with us today for this roundtable. Also to thank Elke Duiker, to Sylvie Mikowski, the co-editor, who's also on the editorial board, to Kathy, and to Daniela Theanova. Also the many members of the advisory board for their support in bringing, in terms of doing peer reviewing and contributing to the issues that we've had in the past and will have in the future. And of future issues, I should also just finally just let you know where we're going after this important issue. So issue 7.1 will be coming out in the spring, in the April-May time. And that's remapping. It also has a kind of a borders reference of sorts in it. It's remapping Irish literary and cultural landscapes in the mid-20th century. And that's been edited by Yen-Chi Wu and by Phyllis Bowman. So I'm really looking forward to seeing that issue in the spring. And then issue 7.2 in the October-November next year, New Identities in 21st Century Irish Writing, and that'll be edited by Ralph Hakel from University of Leipzig and Caroline Luzin from University of Mannheim. And I should say that both Phyllis Bowmans and Yenshi Wu are from KU Leuven University, which of course is in a way the home to EFACIS in terms of our Centre for Irish Studies, and the EFACIS offices are based on the campus of KU Leuven, and they've been extraordinary support to us in terms of facilitating what we do, and indeed the RISE platform itself is hosted through KU Leuven. So I should also thank that institution for the support that they've given to us. And I think that's more or less it for today. So thank you all. Take care. And we look forward to meeting you and interacting with you all again in future roundtables of EFACIS.